I'm Carolyn Whitmore, 69 years old, and retired after nearly 4 decades teaching English literature at a small coastal college in Oregon. I've spent most of my life reading other people's stories, never imagining mine would one day unfold over a bruised cheekbone and a dinner invitation. I should have declined. My son, Fletcher, and his wife Olivia had asked me to meet them at a new restaurant by the water. They said it was just dinner. But Olivia never does anything without a plan. 3 days earlier, my cousin passed away and left me an inheritance. Neither of them expected by the time the dessert menu arrived, I would know exactly what they were after and how far they were willing to go before I go any further. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand your ground with family when it mattered most. I still live in the same little house my husband and I bought before our son was born. It's quiet here, filled with books we collected over the years and photos from better times. I taught at Shoreline College for 37 years until retirement. 5 years ago, back when students still rushed across campus with backpacks and notebooks, and the air always smelled of sea salt and strong coffee from the cafe across the quad. My husband, Edward, passed away when Fletcher was just 14, a heart attack in the middle of a conference weekend. It was sudden and sharp, like someone had torn the center out of our lives with no warning. After the funeral, I promised myself 2 things. 1, I would give Fletcher every opportunity we'd dreamed of giving him together. And 2, I would never let the grief harden us. I took on more courses, more grading, more hours than I thought I could bear, just to make sure Fletcher could attend the kind of schools Edward would have wanted for him. And he did. He thrived. Business school, then a master's in finance, then a position at a large firm in Portland. I was proud of him, still am in ways, but something changed when Olivia came into the picture. She called me just days after my cousin's funeral. Her voice, syrupy sweet. "Just checking in," she said. "We're worried you might be taken advantage of." She meant the inheritance. Olivia has always been polite on the surface, but her eyes tell a different story. And Fletcher, well, he rarely speaks for himself anymore, not when she's in the room. My cousin Marion wasn't close family in the everyday sense. She lived in New York. Mostly sometimes Paris. She was an artist of some renown, and her work was bold and strange and unforgettable to everyone but the market, which had finally caught up to her brilliance. She left me her collection and a sizable fund to preserve it. I didn't expect it, but I knew what I wanted to do with it the moment I read the letter. There's a worn old Victorian house on Makova Street I've admired for years, tall windows, a corner turret sagging from the years, but still proud. I wanted to turn it into a cultural space, a place for Marion's art, for poetry readings, book clubs, film nights, children's writing workshops, something small but meaningful. Something this town no longer has. When I told Olivia she didn't hide her disappointment, she offered instead to have Fletcher invest the money. Just sitting in a bank account won't do any good, she said, as if its only worth was what it could yield in returns. I told her I had plans of my own, and her tone cooled instantly. That Friday dinner came faster than I liked. I wore the same navy blue dress I'd once presented in at a literary symposium. Simple, clean, nothing that would draw attention, and certainly nothing Olivia could use against me. My grandson Theodore had delivered the invitation himself, along with a pointed remark about the dress code. "It's a formal place," he said flatly. "Just so you know," and that told me everything I needed. They'd booked a table for 6 at a place I'd never heard of. Glossy and modern, perched over the shoreline with lighting that made everything look like a magazine spread. Fletcher and Olivia were already seated with their children and another couple I hadn't met before, Gregory and Veronica Shepherd. Olivia said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "He's a colleague of mine, specializes in property law." I knew then this wasn't just dinner. It was a presentation, and I was the client. I took my seat and smiled at my grandchildren. Theodore, now 16, quiet and distant. Eleanor, 12, with her mother's dark hair, and my green eyes, both polite but guarded, trained already to keep their feelings behind glass, before the appetizers had even been cleared. Olivia began. She asked how far I'd gotten with the house. She said, Gregory might be able to offer legal guidance, property tax liability, estate planning. Fletcher nodded along. I said, thank you, but no, I had my own attorney, and everything was already being handled. That's when Olivia leaned toward Fletcher, whispered something so quietly I couldn't make it out. But the shift in his face told me what I needed to know. Something had changed in him, and I felt it coming. He set down his wine glass, looked at me and said, we should talk about your future. The moment Fletcher said the words, your future, Olivia folded her hands in front of her and gave the kind of look someone gives before announcing a major change to a company policy. He didn't wait for my response. We think it's time to consider moving into Golden Harbor, he said. It's a beautiful place. Full care services, social events, wellness programs. I glanced at the couple across from me, Gregory and Veronica Shepherd, both suddenly quiet. Gregory straightened his tie like he knew what was coming. Olivia spoke next. We've already spoken to the admissions team. They have a space available. They'd love to meet you next week. I kept my eyes on the silverware, listening. Fletcher's voice was calm, but there was something practiced in the way he laid out the details. It's not that we think you can't take care of yourself, he said, but this house project? It's a lot. It's too much. At your age? I didn't speak. I just sat there letting them finish. When I finally looked up, I could see the children watching me. Theodore had lowered his phone. Eleanor looked uncertain. I turned to Olivia. Is this your idea? She shook her head lightly, smiling. It's just a suggestion. We care about you, Carolyn. We want what's best. I nodded once slowly, then turned back to Fletcher. And what happens to the inheritance if I do this? He hesitated. Well, if you're not taking on the cultural center, then yes. I suppose we'd look into using the funds more efficiently. I pushed my chair back just slightly. Efficiently. Olivia leaned forwards again this time, with a softer tone. We just want you to be safe. We're thinking about the future, about the kids, about the family. I looked at Theodore and Eleanor again. Their expressions didn't change. I folded my hands in my lap. I've already made plans, I said. The house on Makova will be mine by the end of the month. I've spoken to an architect and a curator. I've done the numbers. Fletcher exhaled sharply. You're not listening. I am, I said. You're asking me to abandon something meaningful so that you can repurpose the money. I heard you. Gregory cleared his throat and offered a polite interjection. There's always room for compromise. A cultural center can be costly. Perhaps some of the money could be diverted into a trust. For the grandchildren. Olivia nodded. 50-50, she said. Half for the center, half for the kids' future. That's fair. I didn't answer. I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip. It was quiet for a moment, the clink of forks and plates from nearby tables the only sound. Fletcher looked straight at me. You're being unreasonable. I set my glass down and folded my napkin. I've already provided for their education, I said. That was done years ago. Everything else is mine to decide. Olivia's voice hardened. So, you're going to throw all of this away? On a vanity project, Fletcher leaned in. It's not about the money, Mom. It's about legacy. You always talked about leaving something behind. This center, it's not what people will remember. We're your family. That's your legacy. I looked at him. Then act like it. He blinked, startled. His mouth opened, then closed again. Olivia, ever composed, shifted in her seat and leaned toward him. I couldn't hear what she said, but I watched his face change. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed. He sat back and turned to me. You know what he said. You always do this. You always assume you know best. That we're all just small, selfish people who don't see the bigger picture. My eyebrows rose slightly. Fletcher, you never respected me, he said. Never. You always looked at Dad like he was some grand figure, and I could never live up to him. My hands were still in my lap. That's not true. You might not have said it, he continued, but I saw it. Every time you talked about him, every time you brought up his ideas, his values. You've spent your whole life trying to preserve what he left behind, and now you've got this inheritance, and you're trying to build something in his name, not yours, not mine, not ours. His. I sat there listening to him say these things he'd clearly carried for years. He was red-faced now, his voice rising with each sentence. The other diners had begun to notice. Eleanor's eyes were wide. Theodore stared down at the table. Olivia didn't stop him. You think I'm a failure? He said. You think my life isn't enough. My work, my family, none of it measures up to your perfect memory of him. Fletcher, I said as calmly as I could, this isn't about your father. Yes, it is, he snapped. It's always been about him. You can't let him go. The moment stretched quiet except for the distant clatter of plates in the kitchen. I opened my mouth to say anything to de-escalate, but Olivia leaned in again, whispering something too low for me to catch. I saw his hands clench, saw his eyes darken, and then he stood up. I barely had time to react before his hand came down across my cheek. The sound rang louder than I thought it would. I staggered backward, and the chair scraped sharply against the tile as I fell. I heard someone gasp. A waiter called out. For a second, I couldn't see clearly. The room spun just a little. My cheek burned. When I lifted my head, I saw Olivia standing, but not moving toward me. Her eyes didn't show shock. Only a brief flicker of something I couldn't name. Fletcher stood frozen, his arm still half raised, his expression blank. Eleanor was the first to move. She dropped her phone and ran to me. Grandma, she said, her voice trembling. I sat up slowly, the pain settling in like a low throb. I touched my cheek and winced. Fletcher took a step forward. He started. I didn't mean to, Mom. I shook my head. A manager appeared. People whispered. I let Eleanor help me up. I didn't say anything. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just walked toward the door and out into the evening air. The taxi driver didn't ask questions. He took one look at my face and drove in silence. When we pulled up in front of my house, I paid in cash. My hands shook slightly as I turned the key in the lock. Inside, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the living room in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic down the hill. Later, I would remember Fletcher's face at the exact moment his hand struck me. Not the rage, but the cold distance just before it. I had seen that look before. On his father's face, never. On Olivia's more times than I could count. I sat there for a long time, the quiet pressing in on all sides, the ache in my cheek sharp and full of heat. The bruise would come by morning, and so would the decision I had been avoiding for far too long. That night, I didn't sleep. But by sunrise, I knew what needed to be done. The bruise settled in by morning, deep violet near the cheekbone, and fading to yellow around the edges. I stood in the bathroom, brushing my hair back, studying the swelling in the mirror. The skin felt tight when I tried to smile. I didn't bother with makeup. I wasn't going anywhere. That day, I didn't turn on the radio. I made coffee, but it sat untouched on the counter. I walked from room to room without any real purpose, just circling the house like I was trying to find something I'd misplaced. I'd lived there for over 40 years, raised Fletcher in that house, buried Edward from it, retired into it. And somehow, It felt foreign now, like I was standing in someone else's quiet. It was close to noon when I heard the knock. I didn't move at first, thinking maybe it was a delivery. Then the knock came, again softer this time, followed by the familiar creak of the porch railing. Tabitha. She didn't wait for me to open the door. I heard the key one I'd given her over a decade ago turn in the lock, and then she stepped inside. Carolyn. Her voice echoed gently through the front hall. I stayed seated on the couch, hands folded over a throw pillow in my lap. She walked in slowly and then stopped when she saw me. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Her eyes went to my cheek. She didn't gasp, didn't ask what happened. She walked over, sat beside me, and reached out like she might touch it, then stopped herself. "I brought soup," she said after a while. "From that little place you like. The one near the bookstore." I nodded, still quiet. "Do you want to talk about it?" I looked straight ahead past the bookshelves toward the window. "He hit me," I said. My voice came out smaller than I expected. "At the restaurant." Tabitha didn't ask who. She didn't need to. I didn't see it coming. One minute we were talking about the inheritance, and the next, he just stood up and I stopped. Eleanor helped me up. She was the only one who moved. Tabitha sat back against the cushion. "What did Olivia do?" "Nothing," I said. She didn't even blink. We sat in silence for a while. The clock in the hallway ticked on, marking the spaces between our words. Finally, Tabitha said, "Are you going to press charges?" I shook my head. "No, I needed to say it out loud." She nodded. "Do you want me to stay for a bit?" "No," I said gently, "but thank you." She stood, crossed the room, and came back with a cool cloth. She handed it to me without a word. I pressed it to my face and closed my eyes. Tabitha didn't ask any more questions. She stayed a little longer, then let herself out. After she left, I moved to the dining table and sat down with a notepad. I didn't write anything for a long time. Just sat with the pen resting in my hand. When I finally did begin to write, it wasn't a letter. It was a list. Names, tasks, decisions I had been avoiding. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Sharon Willis, and she's known me since I first made a will after Edward passed. I asked her to come by the house. When she arrived, I made tea, and we sat at the kitchen table, papers spread out between us. "I'd like to revise the will," I said. She nodded, patient, as always. "What would you like to change?" "I want Fletcher removed as a beneficiary." "Entirely." She didn't flinch. "Do you want to include anyone else in his place?" "Yes," I said. "The cultural center. I've outlined how I want the funds allocated, the building, the preservation of Marion's collection, the community programming. It's all here." She took the papers and reviewed them silently. Then she said, "Do you want to leave anything to the grandchildren?" I hesitated. "Not through Fletcher and Olivia. If Eleanor or Theodore want to come to me, they'll know where to find me. But I'm not giving them something just to have it taken or twisted." She nodded again. "Understood." We spent the next hour going through the documents. By the time she left, the first layer of what needed to be done was underway. It didn't undo what had happened, but it was movement. That evening, I made a pot of soup chicken with rosemary and barley and actually ate it. I even turned on the lamp in the corner of the living room, the one Edward always liked when he read after dinner. It had been years since I'd used it. The bruise faded slowly, turning green around the edges. I avoided mirrors for a while. I didn't take any calls from Fletcher, though there were several. One voicemail from Olivia. "We're concerned," she said. "That was a terrible misunderstanding. We want to make things right. Please call back." I didn't. 3 days later, a bouquet of lilies arrived. No note, just a card with the name of a florist I didn't recognize. I left them on the porch until they wilted. One afternoon, I stood on the sidewalk in front of the old Victorian on Makova Street. The front porch leaned slightly, the railings chipped the windows dusty. But I could see it, the gallery space in the front rooms, a reading nook beneath the stairs. Upstairs, small studios for visiting writers or artists. I pictured children's art programs in the summer, evening lectures on the lives of artists like Marion, community concerts, spoken word nights. I stayed there until the sun shifted and the sidewalk cooled under my shoes. Then I walked home. The next day, I called the real estate agent. "I'm ready," I said. The closing took less than 15 minutes. I signed the papers with a steady hand, flipped through the final documents, and passed them back across the desk. The real estate agent smiled and reached for the brass keyring sitting in a dish beside the folders. "Here you go," she said. "It's all yours now?" I slipped the keys into my coat pocket and walked out into the parking lot. It was a cold morning, the kind that made your breath linger in the air a little longer than usual. I didn't drive straight to the house on Makova Street. I stopped at the hardware store first, picked up a fresh notepad, a set of measuring tapes, a pair of gloves, and a thermos of coffee from the little cafe by the train tracks. Then I turned onto the side street where the old Victorian sat waiting. The front door stuck a bit when I turned the lock. The hinges creaked and a gust of dust stirred the light as I stepped inside. I walked slowly through each room. The floors were worn, the ceilings high and ornate. The wallpaper peeled in places, and the kitchen had long since been gutted. But I knew what it could be. I had drawn it out in my mind 100 times where the display cabinets would go, how the light would filter into the south-facing reading room, which of Marion's paintings would hang above the mantel. I stood in the front parlor and set the thermos down on the windowsill. Then I pulled the gloves on and got to work. I cleared debris from the corners, removed nails from the wall studs, swept the wooden stairs that led to the second floor. I wasn't trying to do it all at once, just enough to feel like I had started. For days I worked quietly. I kept a list of everything wood rot in the back wall plumbing that needed to be redone, windows that had to be resealed. I called an old friend of Edward's, a contractor named Alan Rudd. He came by with his clipboard and his measuring tools. Took a slow walk through the house and scratched his chin the way men do when they're thinking. "It's going to be a project," he said, smiling a little. "But it's got good bones." We shook hands, and he promised to send an estimate by the weekend. I stood in the driveway as his truck pulled away and let the morning sun warm my back. A breeze rolled in from the hills. I closed my eyes for a moment and let it settle. That night, I pulled Marion's old journals from the bookshelf and began laying them out across my kitchen table. There were dozens of them, some spiral-bound, others leather-covered, many with pages tucked between the covers like afterthoughts. She'd documented everything: sketches of town squares, detailed notes on community centers she'd visited across the country, outlines of what a cultural space could look like. I found one entry dated November 1989. "The heart of a town is not its businesses. It's the places where people gather without needing a reason. That's what I want to help build someday." I turned that sentence over in my mind for a long time. 2 days later, I took the folder of journal pages and my own renovation plans to City Hall. I had made an appointment with the zoning office to inquire about permits, historical preservation guidelines, and available grants. The woman at the front desk was named Joyce, and she had worked there since the 1970s. She still wore brooches on her sweaters and called everyone Unnoticed Cultural Center, she said, leafing through my packet. "That's ambitious." "I have the funding," I said, "and I know what I want to build." She looked over the sketches, paused at one of Marion's architectural studies, and gave a little nod. "You're serious?" she said. Then she smiled. "Let me pull a few forms for you." We spent nearly an hour going over paperwork. When I left, I had a thick envelope under my arm and a tentative meeting scheduled with the city's preservation board for the following month. I stopped at the grocery store on the way home and picked up a bouquet of daffodils, Marion's favorite. I placed them in a tall glass vase by the front window of the Makova house, right where the future reception desk would go. A few days after that, Tabitha came by with 2 boxes from her garage. Old photo albums, she said, and some of Marion's things I'd forgotten I had. We sat on the floor in the center of what would one day be the gallery room and opened the boxes slowly. One held fabric swatches, ceramic beads, tiny labeled bottles of glaze. The other was filled with old photographs, black and white shots of Marion in her early studio days, teaching classes at the community center, painting at the county fair. We worked in companionable silence for hours. As the light faded, I lit one of the old oil lamps from the fireplace mantel and let its flicker play against the photos on the floor. The next morning, I received a registered letter. The envelope was thick, the handwriting tight and precise. It was from Fletcher. Inside were a series of legal forms, a petition to review the will, a letter from his lawyer contesting the removal of his beneficiary status, and a brief note handwritten in ink. I hope you'll reconsider. We all make mistakes. Don't erase your family over a single night. I read the sentence twice. Then I placed the entire packet back into the envelope and set it on top of the wood stove, where I lit a match and let the flame take it slowly. By the end of that week, the renovation had officially begun. Alan arrived with a small crew. They brought ladders, toolboxes, new lumber, and plenty of noise. For the first time in years, the house echoed with movement. The sound of hammers and laughter and boots on old hardwood filled the air. One afternoon, as I walked through the front room with Alan, he paused and pointed toward the old front window. That hill across the way, what do you think about adding a small patio? Could be nice for outdoor events. I nodded. Marion would have liked that. He smiled. Well then, we'll make it happen. The envelope was light. Just a single sheet of paper inside, folded once neatly. I found it on my porch that morning, wedged beneath a potted basil plant I'd forgotten to water. No stamp. Just my name, written in soft, careful handwriting. Eleanor's. I brought it inside and let it sit on the kitchen table while I boiled water for tea. The house was quiet. Renovations had paused for the week while Alan waited on materials. Without the sound of hammers and drills, the silence seemed louder somehow. I opened the letter, slowly smoothed it flat beside my mug, and read, Dear Grandma, I don't know if I should be writing. I'm not supposed to. But I saw what happened at the restaurant. I saw the look on your face when Dad hit you, and I've been thinking about it ever since. You were always kind to me. You helped me with my science fair project in 4th grade, remember? The one with the clay volcano? You didn't laugh when it collapsed. I miss you. Love, Eleanor. There was a small heart drawn at the bottom. I sat with the letter in my hand for a long time. The corners had already begun to curl as if she'd been carrying it around for days before finding the courage to leave it. Later that afternoon, I drove to the hardware store again. I picked up a wooden box and a lock, then stopped by the post office and rented a small P.O. box under the name C. Whitford. When I got back home, I tucked the letter inside the wooden box and slid it into the top drawer of the old sideboard in the hallway. The next day, I mailed a letter back to Eleanor. Just a few lines. Dear Eleanor, thank you for writing. I remember the volcano. I remember how you named it Mount Muffin because you thought it sounded less scary. There's no rule that says you can't write to me. I'll be here. Love, Grandma. I included the address of the new P.O. box and sealed the envelope. I didn't expect a reply. But 2 weeks later, another letter came. This time with a sketch tucked inside a pencil drawing of the Makova Street house. It wasn't perfect, but it captured the tall windows and the sloping porch in a way that felt tender. She had signed it in the corner, E.L. Her letter was longer this time. She wrote about school, about how she'd joined the art club but hadn't told her parents. She said Olivia thought art was a phase for lazy people, and Fletcher had once called it a waste of perfectly good tuition. She said she didn't agree. I wrote her back that same evening. I told her about Marion's journals, about the plans for the community gallery, and about how some ideas were worth protecting even if no one else understood them. Our letters became steady after that, once a week, sometimes more. She never used the family's return address, always different drop spots: a friend's apartment, the high school front office, once even a local library. I began keeping each envelope in its own folder marked by date with little notes about what I'd sent in return. The house was beginning to take shape around this rhythm. The front windows had been repaired and reglazed. The stair banister had been sanded and stained to match the original wood grain. We found a hidden storage space beneath the attic floorboards, and inside were old pamphlets from the town's founding days, folded maps, hand-drawn illustrations, and a sealed envelope addressed to the next dreamer who finds this. I gave that envelope to Eleanor. In one of my letters, I described the find and told her I'd saved it for her. "Not everyone gets to open a door into the past," I wrote, "but you're the kind of person who should." A month later, she left a package in the P.O. box. Inside was the envelope now opened and a note. She had found an old newspaper article tucked inside a write-up from 1912 about the building's original owner, a woman who ran an after-school music program in that same house. "I think it's always been a place for people like us," she wrote. That weekend, I walked the perimeter of the house again. Alan had installed new lighting in the entryway, and the foundation work was nearly finished. I stood by the edge of the side yard where the patio would go and looked out toward the hills. The wind was soft that day, and somewhere nearby someone was burning leaves. When I got home, I found a message on my machine. Tabitha's voice. "You might want to sit down before you check the paper. Today's business section, bottom right corner." I pulled the newspaper from the stack near the door and flipped through. There, tucked beneath a column about local construction projects, was a brief announcement: Whitford Estate contested legal proceedings filed by Fletcher Whitford and Olivia Sloan against Carolyn Whitford over inheritance revocation and alleged undue influence in property acquisition and trust restructuring. No quote from me. Just a few lines about long-standing familial assets, contested revision of legacy documents, and pending court review. I read it once, then again, then folded the paper in half and slid it beneath the coffee mug. I didn't call Fletcher. I didn't call Olivia. Instead, I went upstairs, opened the top drawer of my writing desk, and pulled out the list of community sponsors I'd begun compiling months earlier. At the top of the page, I wrote in neat block letters, "Whitford Cultural House Community Trust." The courthouse lobby was cooler than I expected. Polished floors, quiet footsteps, the soft rustle of papers behind the glass reception desk. I'd been there once before, years ago, when Edward and I signed the final documents for the land trust in Marion's name. Now I was back with a folder of my own. I checked in at the probate window and took a seat near the window. I'd come prepared notarized documentation of the property transfer, the amended trust paperwork letters from the gallery's board, and a petition to register the Whitford Cultural House as a community nonprofit under independent management. I didn't know if it would stop Fletcher and Olivia's challenge outright, but it would draw a line. The clerk called my name. I handed over the papers and she flipped through them carefully, marking notes with a small blue pen. "We'll notify you of the hearing date," she said. "They've requested one." As I walked out, my phone buzzed. A message from Eleanor. I sent it. Just that. No punctuation. When I got home, I found her letter in the mailbox postmarked the day before. A printed statement neatly typed and signed in pen. "I, Eleanor Sloan, submit this letter voluntarily. I witnessed my father strike my grandmother, Carolyn Whitford, during a family dinner in public view. My mother, Olivia Sloan, did not intervene. I have seen them speak of removing her from the family estate, controlling the will, and hiding correspondence. I do not believe they are acting in anyone's best interest but their own. Attached was a handwritten note. I'm sorry it took me this long. That evening, I scanned the statement and forwarded it to my attorney. Tabitha came by shortly after with a tray of lemon bars and 2 cups of tea. We sat on the porch while the sun set behind the hedgerow. Are you nervous? She asked. I nodded. They'll come hard. She looked out at the yard where the newly poured patio foundation was still curing. Then let 'em. This time, you're not alone. 3 days later, news broke. Somehow, Eleanor's letter had leaked posted anonymously on a town message board, then picked up by a local columnist who remembered the restaurant incident. They ran the story under the headline, Community Space, Divided by Family Feud, Granddaughter, Breaks Silence. By noon, my phone had lit up with missed calls and voicemails. A few were from neighbors offering support. A handful were from reporters asking for statements. One was from the school counselor saying Eleanor had requested to speak with me in person. We met at the corner bench outside the public library. She looked older than I remembered, shoulders held higher, eyes a little more certain. She wore a gray coat and fingerless gloves and carried a leather-bound sketchbook under one arm. I thought you might be mad, she said. No, I said quietly, just proud. She nodded once, then opened her sketchbook and turned it toward me. A pencil rendering of the Whitford house now fully restored in her drawing arched windows, fresh shutters, people standing on the porch holding art supplies and music cases. I thought maybe we could add a summer camp, she said. I smiled and reached out to touch the edge of the page. We'll need a name for it. That night, I worked late into the evening revising the mission statement for the gallery. I included new language about youth programming, community access, and intergenerational learning. I added a paragraph about Marion's legacy and another about the people who'd helped preserve it even when it wasn't easy. The next week, the court date was set. Fletcher and Olivia showed up with suits pressed and smiles thin as wire. Their attorney spoke first, arguing undue influence, mental decline, lack of transparency, and sudden revocation of family rights. My lawyer responded simply. My client acted within her rights. The property was her legal inheritance, and we have testimony from a minor directly harmed by the plaintiff's conduct. Eleanor sat beside me, hands folded in her lap. When the judge asked if she had anything to add, she stood slowly and read from a small note card. Her voice was steady. Families don't disappear overnight. They erode. When you stop listening. When you decide who matters and who doesn't. My grandmother never erased anyone, but she made room for people who had been pushed aside. And that includes me. There was a long pause when she finished. Then the judge leaned forward and asked for a recess before final review. Outside the courtroom, Olivia turned sharply toward Eleanor. You'll regret this, she hissed. You don't know what you've started. Eleanor didn't flinch. I do, she said. I've started over. Back at home, the crew had finished the new garden path. It led from the front steps to a wide circular bed filled with native plants and a single bench in the center. I sat there that evening with Eleanor beside me, watching the first bees drift between blossoms. The air was warm, just on the edge of spring. The ruling came the following Friday. We were asked to return to the same courtroom, same pale green walls, same worn pew-style benches, same long table with the microphone that always crackled a little at the start. Fletcher and Olivia sat at their table with stiff backs and unreadable faces. Fletcher kept one hand on a leather-bound folder, tapping it twice every few minutes. Olivia wore a deep red scarf and didn't look up when I walked in. The judge entered without ceremony. She adjusted her glasses, flipped through a short stack of papers, then addressed the room. In the matter of the Whitford estate and the petition to challenge recent property and trust revisions, the court finds the documentation legally binding and properly executed. The transfer of the Whitford Cultural House to Carolyn Whitford stands. The additional filings for nonprofit status and board governance are approved. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The judge continued. Furthermore, the personal testimony submitted by Ms. Eleanor Sloan, while not determinative on its own, carries significant weight regarding the plaintiff's intentions and conduct. The court sees no merit in the claim of undue influence. The petition to contest is denied. Eleanor reached over and gave my hand the lightest squeeze. We walked out into the morning light with a copy of the ruling in hand. No cheers, no crowd. Just the slow sound of heels on courthouse steps and the start of a breeze picking up in the trees nearby. Tabitha met us outside with 2 travel mugs of coffee. "You did it," she said, then added, "Both of you. We didn't celebrate that night." There wasn't much left to say, but the next morning I opened the gallery's front doors just after 8 and waited. By 9, the first visitor arrived, an older man with a canvas portfolio under one arm and a folded stool in the other. "You still offering space to local artists?" he asked. I smiled. "Always." By noon, 3 more had come. 2 high schoolers with sketch pads and a retired teacher who'd just taken up watercolor again. The walls were still bare, but the air felt different, like something had opened. Later that week, we held our first community board meeting. We sat around the old dining table Marion had once polished with lemon oil every Saturday. Now it was scattered with agendas, proposal packets, and Eleanor's redesigned flyer for summer programs. Fletcher's nameplate was gone. Olivia's, too. In their place sat Eleanor, Tabitha, and 4 other community members from different corners of Whitford. A librarian, a church volunteer, a youth counselor, and a woman who ran the bakery near the post office. Eleanor presented the outreach schedule while Tabitha walked us through the first round of grant applications. I stayed quiet for most of it, just listening. That night, I found a sealed envelope on the kitchen counter. My name was printed neatly on the front. Inside was a letter from Olivia. Just 2 sentences. "You've taken everything. I hope you're satisfied." Underneath it was a check. Made out to the gallery, $10,000. No memo line, no note, nothing else. I placed it in the folder with the rest of the donations. It would go toward the Youth Art Supply Fund. 2 weeks later, a man in a dark gray sedan pulled into the gravel lot behind the gallery. I didn't recognize him at first. Then he stepped out and adjusted the sleeve of his jacket, revealing a small tattoo on the inner wrist. A pine tree. It was Michael, Marion's son, Eleanor's uncle. He walked toward me slowly, then stopped a few steps away. "I heard what you did," he said. I stayed out of it for too long. I nodded, not sure what to say. He glanced toward the porch where Eleanor was setting out folding chairs for the upcoming poetry night. "She reminds me of her," he said, "of Marion." We stood there for a moment longer, just watching. Eventually, I asked, "Would you like to come in?" He hesitated, then nodded once. Inside, the walls were no longer bare. Paintings from local artists filled the West Gallery. Student sketches lined the hallway. One wall was covered in small canvas panels painted by the after-school program, sunsets, street scenes, portraits of pets. In the far room, a piano had been moved into the corner, where an older gentleman was tuning the keys for a recital next week. Michael wandered the rooms slowly. At the far end of the hall, he paused in front of a framed photograph Marion at 17, sitting barefoot on a porch step, her arms covered in clay from her first sculpture class. He looked over at me. "Thank you," he said, "for keeping her here." That evening, Eleanor stayed late to help me clean up. We moved tables, folded chairs, wiped down counters. Just before she left, she stopped in the doorway. "Do you think they'll ever come back?" she asked. I shook my head gently. "I don't know." She nodded like she already knew the answer. The gallery never became a landmark. It didn't draw tourists or land on magazine covers, but it stayed full of sketches drawing on string lines of third graders, whispering about their favorite colors, of veterans painting their memories in soft oils and grays. It was full of the kind of life Marian would have recognized humble, honest, worth protecting. By fall, the after-school program had doubled. We added evening workshops for adults and reopened the ceramics room that had been locked for decades. Eleanor taught on Saturdays, standing exactly where her mother once stood, correcting posture, brushing stray hair from a student's eyes, guiding hands not with pressure, but with patience. People started calling her Miss Eleanor, like it was the most natural thing in the world. One afternoon, just before the first frost, I found a box tucked beneath one of the old workbenches. Inside were slides, dozens of them, labeled in Marian's handwriting. One was dated 1972, Community Sculpture Day. It showed children kneeling around a long, winding form of clay shaped like a river. Their hands were covered in mud, their faces bright. We framed that photo and placed it near the front entrance. Below it, Eleanor added a small plaque that read, "Art belongs to everyone." As the seasons turned, the silence I'd once felt in those halls faded. It was replaced by piano scales drifting from the recital room, the rustle of paper during writing nights, and the careful sweep of brooms at closing time. Even Michael came back slowly, first for meetings, then to help fix a broken kiln. One night, after the last class had ended, I found him sitting in the main gallery, just looking. He said he hadn't felt close to his sister in years. But this, he said, gesturing around, this is hers. Still. Olivia never returned. The check was never mentioned again. Fletcher sent a single email confirming the nonprofit standing, then disappeared into whatever corner of the city still welcomed him. I didn't follow their paths. I didn't need to. That part of the story was over. Some mornings before we open, I still sit on the back steps with a mug of coffee. The garden out back is quiet, then dew clinging to the benches Eleanor painted in soft green. Sometimes I hear a bird call I can't place, or the faint thump of a truck on the road beyond the trees. I think about how much space a person really needs. Not for things, but for meaning, for peace. Marian left this place to someone she believed would carry it forward. I don't know if I've lived up to that, but I know that every time a child presses their first handprint into clay, every time someone lingers in front of a painting longer than they meant to, something of her is still here. If you've ever had to reclaim something you were told didn't belong to you, your name, your voice, your place in this world, I hope you find peace. In knowing this, justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it unfolds quietly, room by room, brushstroke by brushstroke. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. And if you know someone who needs a little reminder that kindness and persistence still matter, feel free to share this with them.